some things about which I've thought a lot at the micro level, because that's basically the level at which the only level at which I can work. Namely, how are the categories with which we work helpful, and how are they a trap? So the categories under which I labor in my too many years long work on Evagrius is, of course, the category monastic. And that category for Evagrius is largely determined by two categorists of the 5th century, Politeia, later Bishop of Helenopolis, but who claimed to be an ardent student of the monks of Egypt, and later the historian Sozomen, who wanted to represent them in a happy way in his continuation of Eusebius's church history. And oh yes, I actually have a very hard time timing myself. So Don, if you would do me the favor of putting some signal in your frame as I approach the 5-minute mark, I would be really grateful. Thank you. Okay, so back to the main topic. So we're dependent on two archivists for our understanding of Evagrius, and those archivists have controlled how he has been received, in as much as he has been received, as a member of or as a talking partner in the conversations of the 4th century. I'm trying to make this as broad as I can, Politeia has somehow created a place for Evagrius, perhaps for good reasons, perhaps for bad, that makes him a monk concerned with monastic things, concerned with an isolated life in a monastery, in which a long time is spent alone out in the desert, quote unquote. Well, I just got up and took off my bookshelf Eva Vipshika's wonderful book, The Second Gift of the Nile, about monks and monasteries in late antique Egypt. And she said, should we be more trusting of everything we read in Politeia sources? Unfortunately not. She goes on to say, one should not believe that all Politeus's claims in places where he refers to his own memories or his named informers can be gladly accepted. She says that the informants referred to by name, the assurances about relating only those pieces of information which the author heard from eyewitnesses, sort of like Thucydides, these are all part and parcel of the repertoire of long-established literary devices for earning the trust of the reader. Christian writers were no different from their pagan colleagues as regards using such techniques. I think that's a beautiful sort of postscript to what Peter said, because it crosses the boundaries of libraries, alleged sources, and the difference between Christian and pagan. And I have discovered that this is the best approach I can take to Evagrius in trying to figure out what he was up to. Something that you cannot learn if you stay on the surface of the literature, but that you must dig into, deep into the text, all the texts of this particular author, if you are to learn what is going on. Now, the topic I chose for today was a topic that is often not associated with Evagrius, namely thinking about the Politeia or the Politeuma in the 4th century. Now, clearly people do this, but Evagrius himself is thought by scholars that Evagrius thinks mostly of the solitary monk and how the solitary monk can correct his behavior or her behavior if you make some allowances for broad application, and get to a state of contemplation. Well, he does talk about this in some works, but I have tried to consider Evagrius as someone who, throughout his career, had a strong interest in how a learned person, a sage, and that's a category that doesn't, or that's an occupation that doesn't know division between pagan and Christian, how a sage could be good for the Politeia. Why would he have been concerned with that, even if we prescind from an alleged monastic context? The answer is the instability of the imperial system, which was well known. It began in the 3rd century, and it affected philosophers, both Christian and pagan philosophers, in the 3rd and 4th century. And these are philosophers who are working in Latin and Greek, because it is a very old tradition that the philosopher is to advise, if not directly rule, at least advise governing authorities. So now I'll take up my paper, or the part of it that I can give. The philosopher should have a guiding role in society. This is simply for Evagrius the given, the way it was a given for any follower of Plato in the 4th century AD, not BC. But this is an area in which Origen's contribution becomes extremely important. Origen believed that the philosopher himself should be, that is, Origen talking about himself, should be able to respond to another philosopher criticizing Origen's kind of philosophy, namely Christian philosophy, respond and rebut in order to give Christians their proper place in guiding human society. Christians and pagans obviously had some differences about how that society should be guided, but the differences disappear when you look at how they thought the philosopher should act, especially with respect to a curial official or a king. Origen was aware, like Origen, Evagrius was aware of the Platonist opposition to Christianity that still existed among the philosophers of the late 4th century. This is another category crossing agenda item 2, because we often study the Christian theologians of the 4th century as if they were not aware of what their pagan schoolmates were thinking. And they were highly aware through the 4th and the 5th century. Evagrius, against Eunapius, Julian, Themistius, and others, wanted to, and particularly Porphyry, wanted to show, like Origen, that Christianity is a superior philosophy. For Origen's argument in favor of Christian philosophy against Celsus was not only that Christianity was true, but also that Christian philosophy reached not only the well-educated and elite, but extended its teaching to include all rational beings in the return to their primordial state, the state of attachment to the one, or God the Father. Origen's view of Christianity, and Evagrius is like him in this, is essentially social and not solitary. And although it depends upon philosophers to guide the church, the expanding society that transcends all social divisions, the membership of Christianity is never limited to philosophers, and that's why It is superior, for instance, to the philosophy of, for Origen, Celsus, and for Evagrius, Porphyry. Several scholars have shown in the past decade that philosophers of the 3rd and 4th century made a bid to guide rulers, drawing again from Platonist political theory. And here I treat Aristotle as a Platonist, but that's a discussion for another day. For instance, in A Threat to Public Piety, Elizabeth Digister showed how Plotinus and Origen, the two most prominent students trained by Ammonius Saccas in Alexandria, mirrored each other's interpretations of Plato's works and developed similar but contrasting views of the relationship of Platonist philosopher to empire. Philosophers should advise rulers and have a shaping role in social norms for the good of the polis and the oikumene. Origen defended his understanding of Christianity as a positive good for human government. And it would be, by the way, very interesting to know how that figured in the conversation that Origen had with Julia Mamaea. But we don't have a record of that conversation, alas. Origen's training can be seen, for example, in the work of his student Gregory, Bishop of Sebaste in Asia Minor in the 3rd century, later called the Wonder Worker, when a hagiographic account was inserted into his biography. Gregory had described the comprehensive education he received in Origen's school in Caesarea. It is an ample account of his training as a philosophical writer and social leader, beginning indeed with arithmetic and geometry and ending in illumination. True to his preparation as bishop and philosopher upon returning to Pontus, Gregory sought to guide the community of local landholders, to encourage them to live lives conformable with the charity and knowledge recommended by the gospel and also by public philosophy. And yes, I am taking Gregory Thaumaturgus as the author of that text. We can argue about that later. Through Gregory's influence and probably his library, the local Christian philosophers who followed him, Eustathius of Sebaste, Basil of Caesarea, Gregory of Nazianzus, and Gregory of Nyssa, also sought to live philosophical lives, now as community leaders and bishops who could interpret scripture in the multi-leveled way appropriate for both sophisticated readers and those who lacked education. Susanna Elm has described how close their aims for both philosophy, rational worship, and public influence actually are. Although the third of these, Gregory of Nazianzus, particularly opposed and wrote bitterly against a non-Christian Platonist, the Emperor Julian, Julian's hostility to Christians and Gregory's bitter antagonism against Julian only mirrored the opposition and similarity between Hellenic and Christian Platonist philosophers of the late 3rd and 4th century. I have a long quote, but in the interest of time, I will omit that. The ardent Christian philosophers of Asia Minor had, in the mid to late 4th century, begun an attempt to apply their philosophy at a number of levels, similarly to the attempts of Origen to construct a comprehensive and philosophical paideia that could reach at their own level all those who responded to Christ, outlining a pattern of life and a way of thinking in accessible works like sermons, or at a more elevated plane in treatises, or in the case of Nazianzus, poetry. Where Basil formulated a public philosophy and exercised it in sermons and letters, or in his rules for the ascetic life, while keeping a more elevated philosophy for discussions of the perception of God, Gregory of Nazianzus attempted a highly public account of the stages of philosophy. In the center of Constantinople, I'm thinking, of course, of Theological Oration 1 and 2, in 380 and 381, but withdrew from the city and returned to Cappadocia and the private form of the philosophical school in his estate home, with friends. The same wind from the ecumenical council, the one that blew Gregory back to the privacy of his villa in Cappadocia, ultimately blew Evagrius to Jerusalem and then to Egypt. This wind was the complex destruction of Gregory's efforts to lead as a Christian philosopher the church in the imperial city, which would mean as well the leadership of the now Christian imperial court. Although Evagrius's departure a year later than Gregory's is cast by his biographer Politeia as the story of a failed yet dangerous love affair and the need to exit the city ahead of a wrathful husband, I believe, I said in my paper, perhaps, really I don't think perhaps, I think there was another or different reason. The failure of philosophy as presented by his teacher Gregory and himself to bring its influence to bear on the imperial court. Then I have some sort of secondary evidence for that, but I'll skip it for now. Does this mean that the two companions who celebrated each other in different literary forms give up philosophy as an attempt to influence the oikoumene? I think not. Despite his relocation, Evagrius had and continued to have ideas about the public realm and its connection with the divine oikonomia. Now, these ideas, I said in the paper that I wrote that these ideas don't really appear in his monastic writings, but the more I read them, the more I realize they do appear in those writings, and the writings can be read in two ways. What Evagrius does, I believe, after he leaves Jerusalem, is to continue life in a philosophical school, which would be the school run by Rufinus and Melania in Jerusalem, reinterpreted as a monastery, by the way, by Politeia, in which Origen continues to be studied as a philosopher, not only for theology as an inner church occupation, but as a philosopher for the oikoumene. And Evagrius is doing the same thing, or a very similar thing, from a retreat, I would probably want to say near a monastery and not in a monastery in Egypt. Now, he has already begun working on this political philosophy in his long collection of scholia, which actually are the largest single work he wrote. And he is the first Christian to use scholia, which he adopts, I believe, from Porphyry. He applies scholia to the works of three political figures. Job, we could entertain why he's political later. Job, David, and Solomon. So scholia on kingship and what a righteous king must be make up Evagrius's largest work. He doesn't organize his scholia by topic. He writes 72 of them on Ecclesiastes, 382 up to Proverbs 31:30, and scholia on all the Psalms. He takes the vocabulary of the scriptures and shows how someone who is able to guide a politeia must act and think. And then he takes that insight and applies the insights in his later works, not only the Gnostic trilogy, that is, the Practicos, the Gnostikos, and the Kephalaia Gnostica, which are always thought to be directed toward contemplative monks, but actually, I believe, apart from the first two works, are also meant to direct a Christian thinker who might have something to do with guiding a political entity. Now, it is possible to divide the topics of Evagrius's Scholia and also the Kephalaia Gnostica into the categories of the ethical and the philosophical, where ethics and philosophy go to make up a sort of public philosophy. And the important thing about these Scholia, as well as the Kephalaia Gnostica, is that they revive the figure of the Gnostikos from the writings of Clement of Alexandria, but apply them now in a new situation. So I'm going to turn for an example. I've shared my paper, and I'm happy for people to look at it, or if you don't have it, ask me for it. I'd be happy to email it to you. There's one scholion that I think demonstrates how the Gnostikos is to guide a ruler, whether that ruler is a local ruler or perhaps a provincial ruler, and perhaps even, should the Gnostikos be so well placed, a ruler in the imperial court. So, commenting on Proverbs 17:2 in the Septuagint, which reads, "The intelligent house servant will rule over stupid rulers, and he will divide the parts among the brothers," Evagrius writes the following compact and telling scholion. "If it is true that, quote, whoever commits a sin is a slave to sin, and whoever has rejected evil and dominated the demons by virtues has ruled over stupid masters, comma, such a one will become also the Oikonomos of the mysteries of God. He will distribute to each of his brothers by analogy to his katastasis." This is a state of being which could be higher or lower, but has to do with intelligence and training. I continue. "He will give the Corinthian milk to drink, but he will give a more solid nourishment to the Ephesian. He will speak of the height, of the size, of the length, and of the depth, that is, of the universe, and will make him to know by these dimensions the divisions of rational nature, that which encompasses it in it, the logoi, or reasons, if you like, which concern the judgment and providence of God, reasons so entirely deep as to escape the human katastasis." Now, there's more to that scholion, which is rather long. I won't read it, but Evagrius wants the Gnostikos to guide someone who has the practical ability to affect political life, because the word is despotes. He has taken the word oikonomos here in the terminology of political office, the assistant to a household ruler, or even to a governor or king, and applied it to the Gnostikos, who is a steward of Christ and an authority in the political order, but also superior to that order, precisely because he is a philosopher. A nearby scholion on Proverbs 17:6a seems to confirm this. The Proverbs line reads, "The entirety of the cosmos of riches belongs to the faithful one, but to the unfaithful, not even an obol." To this, Evagrius appends the comment, "The faithful one," he says, "will see the logoi," that is, the structuring reasons, "of this cosmos, which he has called figuratively riches of the intellect. But the unfaithful, because of the impurity of his soul, will not even know the logos of a thing of no importance. That the riches of the soul is the knowledge of God, Paul teaches when he writes, 'You are wealthy in every knowledge and every wisdom.' If someone wished to show that which is not the conception of this proverb, let him say where they are enriched, those who go about in sheepskin, mistreated, oppressed, denuded, And let him say also how the unfaithful will not have an obol, even though he has seized the wealth of many faithless. I say, these are the many kings and archons of this world. This dense interpretive paragraph, and I realize it is very dense, reflects Evagrius's continuous insistence that it is the philosopher who possesses wealth, really the wealth of knowledge, not civil authorities, kings or archons. And knowledge constitutes wealth because it encompasses the entire field of learning of the world, both physical and metaphysical, that is necessarily, ultimately, and here Origen comes back into play, necessary to allow Christ to rule it by means of the Gnostikos helping the ruler. I have a concluding paragraph. Do I have time, John? Okay. Evagrius never discusses why he revives Clement's term Gnostikos for the philosopher who was also a guide in the Christian Politeia. I am reluctant to say that he does this solely because he wanted to combat a new wave of dualist teaching associated now in the 4th century with the followers of Mani, so thus imitating Clement in the 2nd century, even though it is clear in some portions of his writing that he's responding to that Manichaean community. It is much more likely that he viewed the Gnostikos as distinct from, and perhaps, I think actually likely, superior to the bishop in exemplifying the philosopher's guidance of a now Christian political community oriented primarily to the time and space beyond the visible cosmos. If arriving noetically in that aeon was the goal of every Christian, single Christian or Christian polity, and every rational being as part of the reconstitution of the original transcendent creation, the guidance of the philosopher was far more important than that of the visible politeia, which depended on kings and increasingly included Christian bishops. I'm finished, and I forgot to thank you, Mona, for responding to my paper. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robin. That was wonderful. And just as a reminder to everyone, we're going to fire through the 3 papers, and then we'll take a break. And then after that, Mona will give her response. So at this time, I will hand it over to Paul. I believe you're next. And we will ask Paul to dive right in.
Thank you. You can read the abstract in the bulletin there, so I won't take time to look through that. I did come down with COVID a month ago, and so it kind of slowed some research and writing, but also means I have some leftover agitation of the lungs. So if I start coughing, I apologize for that. I'll try to turn away from the mic as I'm speaking here. So first of all, introduction. In 177, persecution broke out against the churches of Lyons and Vienne in Roman Gaul. Our only witness to these events is a letter purportedly written by the Christian community shortly thereafter. It is contained within Eusebius's 4th century work, the Ecclesiastical History. The date comes from Eusebius's notice that the events occurred in the 17th year of the reign of Marcus Aurelius. According to the epistle included in Eusebius's Ecclesiastical History, the situation at Lyons began with excluding Christians from public places, such as bathhouses and the forum. The townspeople also verbally abused them and pummeled and stoned them. Eventually, several Christians were brought before the governor. When a certain Vettius Epagathus attempted to defend the Christian cause, he too was arrested. While under torture, pagan slaves brought accusations of cannibalism and incest against the Christians. As those rumors spread, public outrage led to further arrests and brutal treatment in prison. Many had their feet stretched in stocks, others were strangled, some had heated brass plates attached to sensitive organs. Eventually, the prisoners Martyrs, Sanctus, Blandina, and Attalus were led to the amphitheater to be made public spectacles. When it was discovered that Attalus was a Roman citizen, he was led back to prison. The governor inquired of the emperor for further instructions. The reply arrived that recanters should be freed, but confessors should be killed. So at the beginning of a local public festival, the prisoners were reinterrogated. When a certain Alexander encouraged the prisoners, he was added to their number. He and Attalus were martyred on the following day. On the last day of the single combats, Blandina was placed in the arena with Ponticus, a 15-year-old boy. Blandina suffered whippings, wild animals, the griddle, and being tossed by a bull. Finally, all of the bodies were destroyed, reportedly to eradicate the hope of resurrection. In 1912, J.W. Thompson wrote an article entitled "The Alleged Persecution of the Christians in Lyon in 177." Professors Allard and Hartog ably replied to Thompson's contention that the event was mere fabrication. Today, nearly all scholars agree that at least some Christians were martyred in Gaul in the late 170s. The question of cause is greatly debated, however. Specifically, scholars seem divided on how much blame, if any, to lay at the feet of Marcus Aurelius, the reigning emperor. So now we move to Marcus Aurelius and the Christians. Marcus Aurelius himself mentions the Christians only once in his Meditations. In Book 11, he pronounces, "How admirable is the soul which is ready and resolved, if it must this moment be released from the body, to be either extinguished or scattered or to persist. This resolve too must arise from a specific decision, not out of sheer opposition like the Christians, but after reflection and with dignity, and so as to convince others without histrionic display." The emperor was critical then of the fanatical Christian martyrs who sought death out of sheer opposition. As Robert Grant explained, the word has connotations of conflict and conspiracy, matters with which the emperor was concerned as Roman statesman, if not as philosopher. Aurelius further criticizes the air of histrionic display. Some have seen another reference to Christians in Meditation Book 1, Chapter 6, where Marcus Aurelius pays tribute to Diogenes, from whom he learned to disbelieve the professions of sorcerers and impostors and incantations and exorcisms of spirits and the like. Nevertheless, exorcism was commonly practiced by Jews and pagans as well. During Marcus Aurelius's time, Christianity had not reached any singular distinction in the realm of extraordinary exorcistic phenomena. Thus, the only clear reference to Christianity seemingly remains in Book 11. Beyond the sparse material in the Meditations, Timothy Barnes lists 5 references to Marcus Aurelius's legislation concerning Christians. He considers 3 of the citations to be spurious. One of the remaining 2 references was found in Melito's petition, now lost. Eusebius quotes a fragment in which Melito asserts, "What never happened before is happening now. Religious people as a body are being harried and persecuted by new edicts all over Asia." Melito seems confused as to whether the rescript came from Marcus Aurelius himself. He says, "If this is being done by your authority, well and good. A just monarch would never follow an unjust course, and we are happy to accept the honor of such a death." Barnes maintains, quote, "A plausible explanation can be offered of both the complaint and the question. The innovation might be that the proconsul, in the edict normally issued by any governor on entering his province, has for the first time explicitly included Christianity among the offenses of which he proposes to take cognizance. That could only encourage the delation of Christians who could not be accused with no fear that the proconsul might either acquit the defendant or round the accuser," end quote. W.H.C. Friend agrees that the new rescripts allow Christians to be accused with a minimal risk to the informer, but lays the responsibility upon Marcus Aurelius himself. The final citation, as discussed by Barnes, is found in the letter from Lyon and Vienne, our piece of literature here today, concerning the persecution in Lugdunum. The epistle affirms that, quote, "Caesar had issued a command that they should be tortured to death, but anyone who still denied Christ should be released. So at the inauguration of the local festival, at which all the heathen congregate in vast numbers, the governor summoned them to his tribunal, making a theatrical show of the blessed ones and displaying them to the crows. After re-examination, all who seemed to possess Roman citizenship were beheaded and the rest sent to the beasts," end quote. From this letter, Martyrs deduces 3 factors. First, the emperor was giving the governor the right to subject Christians to official investigation. Second, the governor's opinion apostasy did not preclude conviction. Third, the emperor, when asked for counsel on the matter, returned to the policy of Trajan, which specified that apostates were to be pardoned. Another rescript not found in Barnes's book ordered the exile of anyone who alarmed the gullible with a fright of the supernatural. Geoffrey de St. Croix notes that this is scarcely relevant to our purposes, especially as we never hear of any Christians suffering under this specific provision. Nevertheless, the legislation does reveal Marcus Aurelius's attitude toward, quote, superstition, a charge commonly leveled against Christians. There's a next section on possible motivations. I don't have time to read that section, but it just goes through some intellectual milieu at the time period: Lucian, Celsus, Epictetus, 2 of Marcus Aurelius's close advisors, Junius Rusticus, Cornelius Fronto, who gave a speech in which he accused the Christians of cannibalism and immorality. as well as some scholars have explained the persecution of Christians as reactionary measures prompted by unfortunate contemporary events, including devastating external wars, internal revolts, and natural disasters. Finally, some look at the rise of Montanism with its zealous fervor and stress and martyrdom. Of course, scholars would speak of not necessarily targeting or focusing on Montanism on those issues, but seeing very similar facets in wider Christianity. So that's that section summarized. The next section is specifically about a Senatus Consultum. Other authors have attempted to identify the cause of the persecution of Christians in Lyon as a Senatus Consultum from 177. The Senatus Consultum de Pretiis Gladiatorum Menuendis, found at Italica or Baetica in 1888, and the Senatus Consultum de Sumptibus Ludorum Gladiatorum Menuendis, found at Sardis, that would be in Asia Minor, in 1906, give witness to the same event. They include fragments of the Senator's Sententia Prima, a speech proposing a Senatus Consultum. Commenting upon an imperial legislative proposal, a senator introduces a recommendation to reduce the financial burden of subsidizing Munera throughout the empire, and to allow the Tres Gallii, the 3 Gauls, to obtain cheap substitute gladiators or trinci from prisoners condemned to death. The inscriptional evidence in Italica and Sardis may demonstrate that Marcus Aurelius desired to promulgate his burden lightening policy throughout his realm. But the measure benefited the 3 Gauls in particular. Due to the barbarian threat, he especially needed the loyalty of the 3 Gauls. Oliver and Palmer claimed that the events of Lyon and Vienne had, quote, never been satisfactorily explained by others, end quote. They tried to interpret the eruption by means of this specific Senatus Consultum by pointing to several coincidences. First, the Christians of Lyon were killed at the festival of the 3 Gauls, like the trinci of the inscriptions, and both were murdered through imperial acquiescence. Second, both the Christians and the trinci were substitutes for gladiators. Third, both the Christians and the trinci were killed in a sacrificial rite. Oliver and Palmer concluded, quote, the outbreak against the Christians centered in the amphitheater at Lyon and culminated in the festival of 3 Gauls in AD 177 because the imperial government had just created for the 3 Gauls a special privilege which enabled the priests of the imperial cult to acquire cheaply and use instead of gladiators, prisoners condemned to death. Friend, Crestes, and Burleigh all supported this hypothesis of Oliver and Palmer to varying degrees. Friend contends that the theory rings true. Shelley Croteau took up this theory in a doctoral dissertation at the University of Missouri, Columbia. She points to the chronological coincidence of the Senatus Consultum and the outbreak of persecution. The emphasis in the Senatus Consultum upon the 3 Gauls, the use of athletic and gladiatorial terminology in the letter of the churches of Lyon and Vienne, their death as a sacrificial rite, and the exhibition of their heads and limbs. The wording in Historia Ecclesiastica, Book 5, is virtual confirmation of the substitution of Christian martyrdoms for gladiatorial games, according to Croteau. This use of trinci in the Senatus Consultum provides a key for Croteau. André Piganiol has identified the trincus as a sacrificial victim whose head was removed and publicly exhibited. In parallel, Eusebius states that the heads of the limbs of some of the martyrs were put on display for several days. And Croteau therefore concludes, it seems highly likely that the Christians are the trinci of the inscription, considering the corroborating, though circumstantial, evidence of time and place, imperial decree, and the necessity of placating Gaul. It is more than an interesting coincidence that the trinci were gladiators and the Christians were gladiators, end quote. Therefore, legally, Marcus Aurelius is innocent of sending Christians to their deaths, according to Croteau. This decree, however, in my opinion, does not explain all of the evidence. The use of athletic terms to describe martyrdom is already present in 4th Maccabees and Ignatius of Antioch, long before the Senatus Consultum. The festival of 3 Gauls was celebrated annually around the 1st of August, but some of the Christians seem to have lost their lives, or at least been imprisoned earlier in the summer. Certainly, many young men and women were condemned and sent to the amphitheater, much like gladiators, but youth and the elderly were also arrested and killed, usually while awaiting sentencing. In fact, the letter explicitly states that the majority of Christians were killed by various tortures while still in prison. The ravaging crowds also looted and destroyed property, and they completely destroyed the remains of the martyred Christians. Obviously, although the Senatus Consultum may help explain the events perhaps, it does not account for all of the phenomena. If the residents of the Three Gauls simply wanted cheap gladiators, they were rather messy in obtaining them. Many of these events appear to be the work of mob violence rather than of task-oriented, a focused program, which brings the next section and the part I hope to be bringing that's kind of new to the discussion, and that's the sociology of collective behavior. Does this then leave us back at square one, only able ambiguously to describe the persecution as, quote, just another popular outbreak, end quote, as Hardy says in his work? Fortunately, the psychology of collective behavior and the sociology of crowds and riots may help perhaps to explain some of the phenomena. As used by sociologists, civil unrest is a broader term than riot. Civil unrest involves a disruption of the typical social order. Civil unrest can lead to collective actions, including rallies, protests, strikes, demonstrations, and riots. A social protest involves both characterizing commitments and a focus countering opposition to be resisted. Sometimes collective actions create new social norms so that individuals within the mass movements behave, that is, act or react, differently than they would if functioning alone. In social scientific theory, crowds are defined as instances of collective behavior in which the participants can be seen and or heard by one another, as opposed to a popular movement. A crowd then is a temporary gathering of a relatively large number of people in a common geographic location at a given time, says George Ritzer. Conventional crowds are usually routinized affairs that are scheduled for definite times and places. Crowds may also arise rather spontaneously, as sometimes happens with celebrations or catastrophes. Snow argues that a conventional crowd becomes unconventional, or a mob or riot, when it becomes extra-institutional and begins to stage deregulated gatherings in spatial areas. John Laughlin suggests that the cause of this shift is often increased levels of emotional arousal. A riot, then, is a subtype of civil unrest in which a crowd becomes embodied in a form of disruptive collective action. A riot can be sociologically defined specifically as a temporary unruly collective action that causes damage to persons or property. The characterization of unruly relates to social perception of the collective action. Sometimes riots operate, to some degree at least, according to their own rules, while riots are commonly construed as irrational from the perspective of participants. They're often characterized as possessing an emerging yet urgent rationale. Such a construal reflects an emic or insider's perception versus an etic or outsider's perception of such collective behavior. Francis Pakes and David Pritchard remind that the rationale of rioting can lead to major social transformation. By examining the events, provocations, and reactions surrounding the formation and development of riots or mobs, one can better understand the associated thinking and acting of the emic perspective. Sociologists contend then that three things are normally in place as an unconventional crowd or a mob or riot erupts and develops. First, conditions of conduciveness. Second, precipitating events, including keynoting processes. And third, facets of escalation. So I'll take those now one by one. First, the conditions for conduciveness must include the population density able to support the collective behavior. Seymour Spielman's statistical analyses demonstrate the greater the population density, the greater the likelihood of crowd behavior. Neil Smelser has also traced the role of population density in the beginnings of riots. Interestingly, the letter of Lyons and Vienne repeatedly describes the role of the multitude or the crowd or the mob. Specifically, we know that large throngs or a conventional crowd of people had already filled Lyons at the time to celebrate the annual festival of the Three Gauls. And the letter affirms that the area was, quote, crowded with people who had come to it from all countries, end quote. In the formation of riots, conditions of conduciveness can be focused through either ambiguity or grievances. Grievances are specific reactions to governmental or other institutionalized policies, such as anti-war demonstrations. So-called ambiguous causes can include generally heightened emotional fervor, as found in riots following sporting events. Sociologists have spoken of celebration riots or revelist riots as one type of a riot. It seems that the festival of the Three Gauls led to heightened patriotism, including native religious fervor. Xenophobia and the strain of immigration may also have played a role. The letter of Lyons and Vienne explicates that many of the Christians were recent immigrants from Asia Minor and Phrygia, and the letter explicitly refers to the role of pagan religious fervor, including opposition to, quote, this foreign and new religion. The influx of immigrant foreigners may have exacerbated social unrest, and a general milieu of conduciveness reflected in social agitation was already fermenting earlier in the summer, becoming more prevalent by the August festival of the Three Gauls, being focused through its mass gathering. An aroused crowd must be mobilized or brought to direct action through so here's the second topic that social theorists often look at, precipitating events or keynoting processes. According to emergent norm theory, a precipitating event can incite new collective behavior that develops within a situation. Typically, the focusing of civil unrest leading to rioting occurs through some keynoting process. A repetitive gesture or utterance, such as a repeated chant, becomes a resonant stimulus for action, such as Yankees go home, or no justice, no peace, or stop the steal, etc. So the letter of Lyons and Vienne explains how the crowds turned into an infuriated and raging mob, and it references the hatred and the fury of the mob. The repeated accusatory call against Christians led to increasingly negative results. For example, Attalus was led around the amphitheater holding a tablet inscribed with the Latin phrase, "This is Attalus the Christian," so that the people swelled with indignation against him. Behind the use of Christian as derogatory labeling stood specific accusations that were gaining plausibility in the social environment, rumors of murder and cannibalism and incest, as well as the charge of atheism. In this context, the letter describes exclamations of every kind erupting from the whole population. Rioting crowds often experience the third facet, would be facets of escalation. Wright describes how the crowd's task activities can turn to such violence as property destruction and looting. In the sociology of collective behavior, these are forms of direct action. Usually at this stage, social control agents, such as the police, attempt to guard the public order. Aldrich explains urban rioters of all historical eras tend to engage in a fairly standard set of behavior. They stage marches, often from one space of symbolic significance to another. They chant slogans, both advocating their cause and denigrating their opponents. They perform petty acts of vandalism, for example, smashing windows, doors, street signs, etc. They loot stores and houses of valuable objects, or in the case of food riots, of basic staples like food. They make threats through symbolic actions, end quote. Sociologists explain that during times of civil disobedience, looters tend to act in groups, while looters tend to act as solitary individuals when responding to natural disasters. During natural disasters, looting is generally a covert or secret private act, while during civil disobedience, looting is carried out brazenly and openly in the full view of others. One notes facets of these developments in the letter of Lyons and Vienne. Those at a distance mocked and hurled insults and gnashed their teeth, while those who were near engaged in direct physical action. The rioting crowd in Lugdunum began to loot and destroy property and then to physically molest Christians. The letter mentions mob-style draggings, beatings, and stonings. Within the letter, the sway of the crowd held power over the guardians of social order. When the tribune and governor stepped in, they began a wholesale arrest of Christians in order to gratify the mob. The narrative directly states, quote, "To please the mob, the governor again exposed Attalus to the wild beasts," end quote. The governor wrote Marcus Aurelius then for instructions, and the emperor replied that Christians were to be beaten to death and recanters were to be liberated. Nevertheless, the governor sent Christians to a sworded deaths in the amphitheater and killed the recanters anyway, both of these contrary to the imperial directives. Historians have questioned the events since they transpired in contradiction to official legal parameters. Nevertheless, under the duress of the social collective pressure experienced during rioting, deregulatory impulses are more likely to arise. We come then to the conclusion. Deregularized collective behavior, beginning with social unrest and leading to mob action, dominated the events at Lyons and Vienne. The context of population density and heightened fervor points in this direction. Keynoting processes, including repeated accusations, cannibalism, incest, and atheism, and the recurrent social labeling of Christians. The unfolding of events leading from public marginalization to property destruction or looting to personal injury reflects the escalation. Civil unrest held a seeming irrational sway over the guardians of civility, even causing them to go against the emperor's stipulations, of course, from the perspective of the oppressed. In this manner, Marcus Aurelius was not directly responsible for the Christian martyrs at Lyons and Vienne. He did not demand or decree their deaths. Rather, through social unrest and precipitating factors, including previously fermenting social agitation, a conventional crowd morphed into an escalating unconventional riot and carried the local rulers in the wake of its pressure. It seems noteworthy that the extant letter of the churches of Lyons and Vienne never states the exact reasons for the eruption explicitly. From their perspective, the Christians could think of no other motivation for the irrational outbreak except a sinister one expressed in apocalyptic terms. The adversary, the devil, the evil one himself had inspired the outbreak, which of course occurs in other martyr texts. The letter speaks of the wild beast, kind of almost like in capital letters, exciting the raging mobs, so they too acted like wild beasts, plural, small letters. From the perspective of those targeted, an unconventional crowd, a riot can be mysteriously diabolic indeed. Nevertheless, social scientific insights can help explain some of the unfolding phenomena, such as conditions of conduciveness, precipitating events, including keynoting processes, and facets of escalation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. That was a fascinating way to tackle that text. Really appreciate that. We will dive right in to Brian now, and that will lead us into a break after that. So Brian, are you able to unmute yourself?
Yep.
All right, there you go.
Okay. Good. So the common good, koinophiles, in Basil of Caesarea. The term koinophiles is found only 3 times in Basil's vast writings. However, if one were to judge by this paucity that Basil was unconcerned about the common good, it would be a tremendous miscalculation. Indeed, the presence of the term in these 3 texts served to elucidate a broad network of related concepts. And it is these related concepts that put flesh and bones to Basil's social ideas. In this way, koinophiles was the organizing principle, a glue of sorts for a wide range of pastoral imperatives. And these pastoral imperatives manifested themselves in the marshaling of actual monetary resources to build actual buildings, to initiate actual services, for the benefit of those on society's margins. Together, these things depicted for the Christian community in Caesarea that a new, different, better kind of society was possible. This paper is part of a larger project assessing the contribution of this broad network of concepts in Basil's thought to that of other patristic authors, a project based at the University of Puebla in Mexico. The project aims ultimately at the aesthetic elements of patristic social thought. And so towards that end, this paper examines the 3 texts in which Basil uses the term koinophiles, or common good. And it's interested in those aesthetic elements, the biblical and cultural imagery employed by Basil to elucidate for his audiences the meaning of the term. In all, the paper will argue koinophiles envisions a kind of human flourishing manifest in unity of mind, of the physical world, and of the spiritual world. Now, in the more full version of this paper, I surveyed the secondary literature on this subject. Most of that literature surveyed Basil's social ideas and thought across a wide array of his texts, with particular interest in his letters. Only one author discussed his use of the term koinophiles, which was surprising to me. But even in that article, it is said that Basil used the term only twice, which is actually not correct. In general, this scholarship points the interested reader continually back to the manifestation of Basil's ideas in his social actions, particularly his actions to alleviate the suffering of the poor, the sick, and the dying. This paper builds on the excellent work of these other scholars, and it asks, however, a slightly different question. What are the aesthetics of Basil's vision for the common good? What are the civic and natural and biblical images in Basil's text that helped to shape his vision, that helped him cast that vision into something meaningful to his audiences? For these three texts where the term koinophiles is found, we are in a somewhat fortunate position. One of the three texts is found in one of the earliest, if not the first, of Basil's extant writings. The second is from a middle period of his ministry, and the third is in a text near the end of his ministry. So we're able to glimpse some development, perhaps, of his understanding of the term through these three texts. The first use of koinophiles is in Homily 12, perhaps the first of Basil's extant homilies, delivered while still a deacon in late 362 or early 363 CE. The homily introduces to its audience the book of Proverbs. Basil introduces it this way, quote, "Everyone who is even slightly acquainted with this text is well aware how difficult it is to grasp its literal meaning." The argument that wisdom is a common good begins in 12.2 and continues through 12.4. In this early part of the homily, Basil examined the significance of Solomon being the author of Proverbs. And then he introduces its treatment both of divine wisdom and human wisdom that Solomon possessed and was sharing with his readers. In 12.2, Basil noted that because Solomon was a good king, his wisdom sayings ought to be accepted with greater weight. This is because good kings say things that are, quote, "considered profitable for all in common, and not for arranging matters for the profit of oneself." And I was thinking here a little bit ago with Robin's paper that Evagrius seemed to have less of a positive view about the role of the political leaders in their wisdom for managing the polis, but that should be left to the philosophers. Basil seems to at least allow some weight for the capacity of wisdom in the political rulers. Now, although using different words here, koine pasi lusiteles instead of koinophiles, Basil is here nevertheless also talking about wisdom as a common good. Even if only a few will appreciate it, wisdom is nevertheless made widely available because it exists for the good of everyone. The biblical images here are 1 Kings 3, 9 through 10, in which Solomon asks God for wisdom, and 1 Kings 3:28, in which the people acknowledged this wisdom in his rulings. These texts reveal God is the source of wisdom. Solomon knew and appreciated this. He also knew and appreciated that God will give wisdom to any who ask. By recalling these texts, Basil revealed his appreciation for God's character, God's love for all people, God's concern for the needs of all. Koinophiles then is the good things of God for the good of everyone. And then, in parallel with this interest in divine wisdom, in 12.4, Basil argued that the Proverbs also illuminate human wisdom, or, quote, the expertise needed in the concrete realities of life. For example, according to Basil, Proverbs reveals the ambitions of humans. If only we pay attention to what is taking place, he says, in every gate, street, wall, and fortress, we will encounter humans yearning for wisdom. So it's the ubiquity both of the search for wisdom and wisdom itself that leads Basil to write this next paragraph. He says, quote, "Then he points out," he meaning Solomon, the author of this proverb, "that wisdom benefits all in common," koinophiles, "and that the benefit it bestows is extended to all alike." He says she slaughtered her own sacrificial victims. In other words, she prepared solid food for those who have the faculties of their soul trained by practice. In a mixing bowl, she mixed her own wine, the wine which gladdens the human heart. Now, what he calls the mixing bowl is the common and universal participation in the goods, whereby everyone is equally permitted to drink of them according to each individual's capacity and need. The principal image here is a bowl filled with wine that never runs dry. It's a symbol of koinophiles, because not only is it an inexhaustible resource, but also it is a resource available to all. Wisdom is something you can never exhaust. Take as much as you want because there will always be more. Everyone can come and drink from the same bowl, and the bowl will never empty of its wisdom. Basil is here reading Proverbs 9, 1 through 2, quote, "Wisdom has built her house. She has hewn her 7 pillars. She has slaughtered her animals. She has mixed her wine. She has also set her table," from the NRSV. Wisdom has done the work necessary to make itself attractive to those who pass by. It is orderly. It is well stocked. The table is set. There's plenty of meat for all who want to eat. There is plenty of wine for all who want to drink. You see, wisdom is prepared. All that is needed are those who want to come for the feast. And who can come is equally inexhaustible and universal. Wisdom is tein koinein, common. The goods of wisdom are available to everyone. No one is exempt. It's not just the intelligent people who get to have it. It's not just the rich who get to have it. It's in accordance with each person's ability that wisdom may be received and cultivated. At the same time, wisdom is, quote, solid food. It's not to be consumed lightly or until one has developed a proper digestive system, if you will, to receive it. So Basil here connects Proverbs 9:2 with Hebrews 5:14. Wisdom is for all, yes, but that does not mean all will receive it in the same way. It takes a well-trained soul, one who can, as the author of Hebrews suggests, distinguish good from evil, that is best able to digest wisdom. And moreover, the never-ending supply of wisdom points to the opportunity continually of even the well-trained soul to return again and again to the bowl of wisdom. Thus, the first time Basil discoursed on koinophiles, he imaged a world in which God's love and care for his creation are manifest in his filling that creation with good things, available to all without exception. One of these good things is wisdom. Its ubiquity and inexhaustibility point to koinophiles' constant renewal and improvement of the human condition. The people with a less formed capacity for wisdom are to be provided with the resources to improve it, such that all may eventually partake of wisdom. And what is more, those already partaking of wisdom may keep coming back for more. There is no end to their capacity for wisdom, just as there is no end to the bowl of wisdom itself. The common good grows increasingly more common and increasingly more good. A second use of koinophiles is in Homily 6, likely composed after the famine in 368. The homily is an exegesis of Jesus's parable in Luke about a rich man who's so obsessed over the disposition of his unexpectedly bountiful harvest that instead of freely distributing the excess, he decided instead to build a bigger barn to hold it. Basil explains the parable and its several details in the homily's first couple sections. And then he applies the text to the lives of his readers in sections 3 to 7, the rest of the homily. And in the middle of that application section, we find this paragraph here. There is no satiety, no limit to your greed is to be found. When children are overly greedy, we often allow them to indulge in untempered gluttony and to overeat so as to bring about aversion through an oversatiated appetite. Not so with the lover of money, but rather the more he is given, the more he wants. If riches flow, set not your heart on them, but you contain the inflow and dam any outlets. When, however, it is contained and dammed, what does it do to you? It breaks whatever restrains it, like a mighty stream through which a myriad of channels waters the fruitful earth. Even so, allow your wealth to flow by diverse paths into the homes of the poor. Wells from which water is drawn become better sources, but when deserted, they putrefy. Riches, when they stagnate, are also useless, but when they move and are transferred, they are of general benefit, koinophiles, and fruitful. What gratitude from those whom you help. Do not despise it. How great the reward from the just judge! Do not doubt it. Let the example of the condemned rich man be before you continually. The principal image here is movement. Water moves, it flows in streams, it moves from larger streams into smaller streams, it animates the earth produces fruit. Even the water captured in wells is kept healthy by constantly drawing from it. Likewise, riches should be in constant motion. The more they move, the more people they help, and thus the more productive they become. And just as movement is healthy for the earth, so too the movement of riches is healthy both for the person moving them and for the person receiving them. It generates spiritual movement too. The poor express gratitude to God. Consequently, God grants divine favor to the rich. However, greedy people restrict movement. They dam up any means by which riches might escape. It's never the case that they are filled and have enough. They're like children with undeveloped awareness of satiety. The only movement in which greedy people are interested is the movement of riches increasingly toward themselves. Yet this restricted movement is unhealthy both for the person restricting riches and the person who lacks them. The rich person is, quote, broken by their many means to try to contain their wealth. Worse still, they face divine rebuke for their greed. To this image of movement, Basil adds a citation of Psalm 61, verse 10. If riches flow, set not your heart on them. You see, the verse contrasts flow with set, movement with stillness. Note also its conditional sense, if riches flow, suggesting that riches come and go across a person's lifetime. They have no permanence. It is their nature not to be contained. Riches have a purpose that is fulfilled in their movement. They must flow. They must continually be transferred from one person to another. Even the best efforts of the greedy to try to contain them will ultimately fail. For even if the riches are able to be stored away for a period of time, they'll eventually be torn away from the greedy person at death. Thus, in this second text, written about 6 years after the first, Basil expanded the concept of koinophiles from one of God filling the good creation with good things to now one of God using movement of natural and material things to create a special kind of balance necessary for human flourishing. Basil calls this movement not only koinophiles, but also fruitfulness, egkarpon. This pivot allowed Basil to redirect his audience's focus away from themselves and towards those on society's margins. Everyone is to benefit from the movement of wealth. The poor benefit from increased care and comfort in this life. The rich benefit from divine mercy in the next. The greater the movement, the greater the benefits to everyone. The third use of koinophiles is in Basil's letter 265, a letter written late in his ministry, 377, was addressed to 3 bishops from Egypt who had fled to Palestine following persecution from Arian sympathizing people, and as we also find out in the letter, from some Apollinarians. Our term appears in the letter's opening section, and it reads as follows. It's a long quote, but bear with me here. We find greatness in all things of the good God concerning the administration of his churches. Thus, the things that seem to be depressing and not at all according to a fixed purpose, these things seem rather to be administered in the scarcely visible wisdom of God and in his unsearchable judgments of righteousness for the benefit of many. For behold, the Lord, having raised up your love from the regions in Egypt, established your love in leading it to the middle of Palestine, in accordance with the memory of ancient Israel, whom the Lord led into captivity into the land of the Assyrians, to extinguish there the idol worship on account of the journey of the saints. And so therefore we find an answer that the Lord opened for you the contest, even through the stadium of exile, to bring forth your piety. And thus he gives visible examples for salvation to the ones encountering your good purpose. Since therefore by the grace of God we have learned your rightness of faith, we have learned also your attentiveness concerning the brethren, and that you neither cursorily nor carelessly omit the common goods, koinophile, and necessities for salvation, but that you intend to produce something for the administration of the churches. We thought it right to become fellow workers of your good contributions, and to join ourselves to your piety by this letter. On account of that, we send also our longed-for son, our fellow deacon Elpidius, indeed the one delivering the letter, but also himself being able to report to you whatever may have escaped notice in the letter. The principal image here is order in the midst of disorder. Basil is here concerned with the right administration of the churches. To the extent this right administration produces a right orthodox understanding of salvation, it may well be regarded a koinophiles. The bishops have attended to the common good of orthodox teaching. Even in the midst of a hardship such as exile, they are praised for having administered their churches well, neglecting nothing. To Basil, their intrepidness in the midst of exile recalled the story of the Israelites' exile to Assyria. As Basil understood it, the Israelites were sent there to extinguish Assyrians' idolatry. Now, Basil likely has in mind here the text of 2 Kings 17, or perhaps Isaiah 10, verse 11. But he has elided many details and, in fact, misrepresented the text. Assyrian idolatry, such as it was in 2 Kings and Isaiah, was located among the foreigners resettled in Israel by the Assyrians after the Israelites were removed. And the text tells us that God sent lions into that region to attack the residents there because they had defamed the land by having worshipped their idols. The Assyrians, in order to stop this attack of these constant attacks of lions, the Assyrians decided to send an Israelite priest back to that land from captivity, send him back there to teach the new residents about the God of that land, Yahweh, the God of the Israelites. Yet the new residents merely added worship of Yahweh to the worship of all their other gods. In the end, God proclaimed through the authors both of 2 Kings and of Isaiah 10 the destruction of these new residents and their idols, just as God had earlier done to the Israelites. So given all of that, Basil merged pious bishops with Israelite exiles. He fused Israel's story with that of the church, and he linked the right administration of churches with the crushing, apparently, of some heterodoxy. And when you read further in the letter, you discover what this heterodoxy is. The bishops tried, if only momentarily, to have failed and to be exiled, to repel the teaching of Apollinarius and his followers. Basil praises them for this. However, the bishops have also, in their exile, accepted the followers of Marcellus of Ancyra, and this is quite upsetting to Basil. As he explained in the last two paragraphs of the letter, Marcellus's position was tenuous at best among Eastern bishops, and these exiled bishops from Egypt should have made a more deliberate inquiry into his status before too hastily receiving his disciples into their midst. Thus, the common goods contributing to the right administration of churches is fidelity to a Nicene orthodoxy, to collaboration with other bishops, to slow and deliberate consideration of others' ideas, to fending off the attacks of the heterodox, and to pursuing these things even in the midst of hardship. Thus, in this third text, written 9 years after the previous one, Basil expanded the concept of koinophile still further, from one of God filling the good creation with good things, and of God doing so through movement towards human flourishing. Here, koinophiles also points to a spiritual reality equally ordered by God toward human flourishing, toward human salvation. It's the task of church officials merely not to get in the way of that agenda in their administering of God's churches. In all, these texts reveal that the common good is about a unity of mind, of the physical world, and of the spiritual world, all for the purpose of promoting human flourishing. And in a final comment here, thinking about some new horizons, in the spaces where Christian systematic theology and social ethics converge today, there has been a resurgence of interest recently in the work of Abraham Kuyper, a Dutch Protestant theologian who also served as Prime Minister of the Netherlands from 1901 to 1905. In rethinking Reformation-era disputes on the two kingdoms, church and state, Kuyper advocated instead for a different concept, something he called sphere sovereignty. To Kuyper, it was a middle position between collectivist ideologies of Marxism, which he called popular sovereignty, and the supremacy of the state sovereignty. Sphere sovereignty, by contrast, says that every part of life, work, family, education, arts, culture, they're all unique social spheres which possess their own unique sovereignty. Moreover, every sphere is entirely dependent on God for its existence. God's creative insight brought everything into existence, including human reason, which created these very spheres. Thus, the sovereignty of each sphere is little more than a recognition of God's hand in creating it for the benefit of human persons. To put this another way, if every sphere is sovereign, then every sphere of which an individual is a part demands of that individual the assumption of responsibility to do what is needed to assure that sphere's divine mandate, its divinely ordained end, is carried out. And I think there is much to commend in Basil's concept of koinophiles in light of this renewed interest in sphere sovereignty. Basil had in view three spheres: human reason, civic, social life, and the spiritual realm. And like Kuyper, to Basil, each sphere not only originated with God, but also demands of us a particular set of actions, such that we may please God in each sphere. Yet unlike Kuyper, Basil's spheres were more fluid. They mixed with one another. Moreover, unlike Kuyper's deductive reading of Scripture in reaction to the rise of Marxism, Basil's inductive identification of biblical texts and images is, to my mind, more pluripotent. I submit that Basil's approach fits better the fluid social dynamics that mark our present age. And once we incorporate justice into the mix, one will sense quickly the wisdom of merging, as Basil did, the spheres of reason, society, and the church. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Brian. Really appreciate that. It is 3:32. Let's take let's see here. We're a few minutes behind schedule, but that's all right. I think people need a stretch. So let's break for 7 minutes. And at 3:40, we will come back and Mona will give her response paper. So 3:40, we will come on back.
Thanking Dawn and John for their hard work on getting this conference together. I know they'd originally wanted to do it in person, and so I think it's working very well for you to have so many international and people from all over the place to be able to be part of this. And I'm honored to be part of the array of the scholarship that's being presented at this conference in this mediated format, as one of my colleagues calls it. I'm going to do a little bit of an advertisement here. As president of the Canadian Society of Patristic Studies and a co-sponsor, I just want to say thank you for inviting us to co-sponsor this conference. I'm glad to see some of my colleagues here, and I would invite others of you to consider checking us out, sharing your research. Thank you. Sharing your research, networking as part of our annual conference. We might meet as part of Congress, which is organized by the Federation of Humanities and Social Sciences in Canada. We meet once a year at the end of May, beginning of June. And we're a fairly eclectic bunch, as patristic scholars, I think, tend to be. We have Canadians and international members that join us. We're a relatively small society, so we tend to run one session at a time, and so get to develop relationships and hear from one another's interests. We have a student essay contest, which might be of interest if you have students. We would accept essays from anywhere. Our call for papers comes out in November, and the abstracts are due usually around the end of January. Okay, that was my advertisement. So let me turn to my esteemed colleagues on this panel. Thank you for entrusting me to respond to your work, the result of obviously many hours of research, thought, and writing. So to Robin and Paul and Brian, I want to thank you for your careful and deep work, especially in the midst of our current pandemic and the various trials you have encountered as a result, some obviously rather directly and otherwise. So the papers have been organized under this title of Social Organization and Positioning. I just want to center myself a little bit. It fits well with my interests, which are things like social history, social theory, kind of on the ground social realities. I'm kind of interested in the nitty gritty of day-to-day life in the ancient world. And I especially think about age structure, and the life course. I work mostly in the late 1st and early 2nd centuries, so I've really appreciated the opportunity to think about these later eras as I read your papers. Let me say too that if I am misreading or misrepresenting some things, please correct me because these aren't my direct areas of study. So the topic of social organization and positioning is also a timely one, I think, in this moment of COVID, as we think about some of the realizations and unveiling of the social effects of racism, of social economic disparity, of climate change. These have resulted from things like flawed systems, ignorance, perhaps a failure of thinking more about what it means to pursue the common good, as Brian has it. I know that the deep study of patristic writers and their contexts is not necessarily undertaken to exact direct lessons for our own day, but I do think that texts and thinkers of the ancient times are translated, pored over, compared, studied, classified, and read today because they connect with us in some way, if only because they explicitly or implicitly provide a comparison or a contrast to our own experiences, thoughts, relationships, and places in the world. They open our minds, sometimes to shake our heads at what we think is ridiculous from our vantage point, sometimes to nod in agreement, and other times to imagine new possibilities. So what can the patristic writers say or demonstrate from their unique vantage points to our unique time, places, and perspectives? So I thank you to those who gave papers this afternoon for their unique perspectives on the martyrs of Lyons, Basil, and Evagrius. So I'll begin, I'll just do an order from what we heard this afternoon already. So I'll begin with Evagrius. Do a little bit of a summary and then some comments and questions for each, and then a bit of a wrap up. So while usually thought of as a monk's monk, I don't know if that's true, but I liked it. Robin Darling-Young argues that before this era of his life, Evagrius studied and wrote in the vein of a philosopher, especially in the tradition of one who would advise and critique those in political power. So this would place him as a voice akin to perhaps the Cappadocian Fathers. She points to certain writings to make her case, particularly his work on the books of Psalms, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes, a bit on Job, where he discusses wisdom for ruling from two good kings, David and Solomon. She shows how some of these texts highlight the role of the Oikonomos as it relates to political roles, namely a steward of Christ who can speak to political authorities because of his knowledge as a philosopher. Her argument also includes what we have left of the Kephala Gnostica, which is about the natural, this is her quote, the natural world as a sign of the transcendent world. So in these writings, she argues, Evagrius interprets the Christian community as both present and transcendent. And like Origen, whom he studied, he argues that Christianity is superior to other philosophies because it embraces not only the elite and educated, but all who be reaching then beyond social divisions. And this is how he then sees himself as being able to inform the political elite. So as someone who studies the life course, I'm pretty convinced by this. It makes sense. It's a good argument to say that perhaps at an earlier time, Evagrius had a different focus, perhaps a more ambitious one, a more idealistic one as a younger man. And I'm quite intrigued by this story that Evagrius flees to Jerusalem because someone else's wife was after him, assumedly a younger woman, portrayed as promiscuous. And then in Jerusalem, and I don't think you read this part, but part in the paper I read, in Jerusalem, he is clothed with a monk's garb by the older woman, Melania the elder. And this seems to be a matter of healing, perhaps a ritualized calling to his new life. So this story is fraught with, to me, stereotypical images of women, one a shameless temptress, the other an ideal mother figure. And what you do is you challenge this story about Evagrius by, at least in part, by then saying, actually, he left for Jerusalem because of a failed attempt at influencing the political authorities, if I'm reading it right. So what's a better story for Evagrius to save face? The shame of unsuccessfully speaking truth to power, or blaming a woman? So turning to some questions. First of all, and I think you may have answered part of this, if we think of Evagrius's other writings as later and reflecting his monastic concerns, what developments do you see over time? And if you see, do you see remnants then of what this earlier interest was, this advice and critique to those who are in political power? And I think you mentioned that as you read more, you are seeing more of that. So that was one question that rose from the paper. The second question is, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the role of the philosopher versus or vis-a-vis the bishop in the 4th century, or even the 3rd century. I realize that there's some shift in influence there, especially with regard to the Christian content, but that difference between philosopher or connection to philosopher and bishop. And then finally, if the goal of philosophical education over those many centuries was to provide advice and critique of the political authorities, how strong is the notion that the ideas ultimately affecting the lives of the non-elite, the uneducated, the masses, which, if I understand correctly, is a great concern for Origen and then also for Evagrius. So do you see this in the writings? And then I'm also thinking of Brian's paper when he's thinking about the idea of the common good. Is that something that has some connection with what you see? Again, I'm not an expert in Evagrius, so some of those might seem like kind of neophyte questions, so I apologize if that's the case. Let me turn to Paul's paper. So Paul re-examines the account of the Martyrs of Lyons in, Lyon is how you pronounced it, in 177 CE. So he's using a sociological perspective, particularly riot theory. So he observes the evidence of a crowd rioting against the Christians. And the reason for the martyrdoms, he argues, is that the state placated the unruly crowd by following through with these martyrdoms. So the theory of rioting follows these 3 stages that can be perceived in the story. First, the conditions were set by having a large population, and then also maybe some xenophobic targeting of immigrants, and especially in light of the recent foreign invasions and plague, that seems to make the conditions right. The Christians were likely seen in this sort of immigrant way. Second, specific events precipitated the rioting, namely the negative labeling of Christians and likely chanting slurs against them, as well as spreading rumors of murder, cannibalism, incest, and atheism. And then third, we have the situation of escalation into violence, including tearing the martyrs' bodies apart, which I found a little bit gruesome, even just secondhand. Although I teach a course on zombies, so I shouldn't be so surprised. As someone who appreciates and uses anthropological models and sociological theories in my own work, I did find this to be a compelling argument. I found there was good evidence to fit the theory, and it did seem to also fill a gap that other theories leave. And I liked this quote, that it helps us to see, quote, many of these events appear to be the work of mob violence rather than a task-oriented, focused program. And I think this is a really helpful way to help us see more of what's going on kind of on the ground. So one of the most helpful aspects of sociological theories is that they ask questions about the social layer of context. And given the paucity of what we have to work with as scholars of text, ancient text particularly, compared to the amount of stuff that a sociologist can work with, can actually ask questions of their informants, this work often takes some level of informed imagination, I think. But as with all imagining, we each have some limits to what we can imagine and what we do imagine given our own cultural, social, and ethnic identity and our experience in the world. It can also open those things, which is good. So it's important, I think, when we're looking at a particular theory to ask where it came from, what populations were used, what vantage point did it come from? Does the theory arise from Eurocentric experience and biases, or particularly American ones, for example? Can it apply or adapt cross-culturally, or is it really a theory that's bound by its own time and place? Are there nuances that might be different in other cultural contexts and time? And how much does my own bias, for example, me as a white female Canadian academic, how much does that affect how I see the theory and how I apply the theory? So sociology is helpful in understanding patterns of observable behavior, but the models and theories constructed from these observations are not really always ethically neutral. So our own ethical kind of spidey sense should be active here. Nevertheless, one of the strengths of this theory in particular is that it asks one of the questions that I think is important. Are there some things that might be worth protesting or even rioting for to affect social change? So we're kind of seeing a different, I mean, the martyrs are the topic of the paper, but or of the letter, but we also have this question around what else was going on for the other people in the historical moment that this is happening. So one question I have about the theory is, and so you may not be able to answer this depending on how much you've worked with the theory itself, but why did some people participate in rioting behavior and others do not? Even if they participate in the levels of protest or civil unrest, not everybody riots. So the most visible part of rioting, which obviously we often see in modern media, tends to be the violence. But I suspect that which receives the violence is rarely, if ever, the real target of the anger. It's symbolic in some way. These are my guesses. It's just a wondering. So if this is a correct reading or a correct way of seeing what's going on here, I wonder about how these Christians in Lyons symbolized what the crowd was actually angry about. Was it them, or was this symbolic of something larger? So perhaps your case for why the crowds were so threatened by the Christians in particular could be strengthened by taking into account more the threat they were feeling to their sense of stability and order of the world around them, and not just or even primarily the Christians. It seems evident that the refusal of the Christians to worship the gods in the face of the masses experiencing invasion, experiencing plague, and you say this might indirectly have caused persecution. But also this idea of being a past-oriented system, a past-oriented people. Were they threatened not just by the newness of this movement and the idea of it being a superstition, but about something greater than that, that was going on, that was shifting the worldview? Now, it's interesting that the accusation of incest, cannibalism, and murder are fairly common tropes in Western history for labeling the other as evil. And of course, this leads to dehumanization and serves also to define us and them. And these are much bigger topics, but it just reminded me of those things. And you mentioned the view illustrates something out of an emic perspective of how the actions could be understood from the point of view of the rioting crowds in some way. And this gets a little bit dicey for me between emic and etic distinctions. Could be a little bit more explored, but it was just a small piece in your paper, but it made me think about it. Finally, I'm curious about the possibility that the Christians were thrown into the arena as a cheap substitute for gladiators during this particular festival of the Three Gauls. Now, what was the function of these gladiators in a ritual sense? And did the prisoners or the Christians in place of them fulfill that function? Or what was going on there ritually? So those are maybe not kinds of questions you've asked or thought about, but I hope it's useful for me to think about some of these things alongside you and your good work. All right, let's turn to Brian's paper. And I hope I can pronounce the things that I need to here in the right way. You'll excuse me if I don't. So Brian focuses on the three uses of the word koinopheles found in Basil's writings, suggesting it's an organizing principle related to Basil's concept of the common good. Now, the first two instances are found in homilies. The first relates to wisdom, a common good that's available to all, like a bowl of ever-flowing wine. And although it's available to all, not everybody will receive it the same way, and it is best cultivated. But ideally, and here I quote, the common good grows increasingly more common and increasingly more good. I really like that. The second instance is written after the famine of 368, and it's found in a homily on the parable of the rich man who hoards wealth. The wealthy should allow their wealth to flow to the poor, Basil says, evoking this image of movement in the natural world, like the movement of water. Made me think of the Taoist notion of Wu Wei. I don't know if exactly the same, but just gave me a similar image. Not the same image exactly, but a similar one. So God uses movement, you say, to create a kind of, this is a quote, balance necessary for human flourishing. So I thought that was really helpful. So the third instance constitutes a later time and a different genre, namely a letter to the bishops who had fled to Palestine due to persecution. And here Basil is concerned about the right administration of churches, involving embracing orthodoxy, collaborative leadership, and opposing heterodoxy. So this is a spiritual dimension involving salvation in the face of hardship. And if I understand correctly, you observe this to be a development of thought over time in a sense of an accumulation of ideas about the common good. And I think the focus you have is sort of on seeing all three of these as part of Basil's thought. So the general idea of this common good and how you've laid it out, I think is great. It's useful. It's a difficult to define kind of notion. And so I think seeing how Basil sees it is really useful. And I also like the guideposts and images that go along with that you've brought out very clearly. And this idea of order in the midst of disorder. I'll come back to that because I also think that's helpful. And it's worthwhile to know something about this tangible evidence of Basil's care for people who are very much in need, who had buildings built in order to take care for those who were traveling, poor, sick, or dying. So that tangibleness, again, is interesting to me. So my first question is about Basil's notion of wisdom for all. This is just a curiosity. Does Basil make explicit particular categories of people? He does talk about the intellectual and the wealthy, but does he ever talk about other kinds of categories, gender or status or age? And I'm thinking here a little bit of Galatians 3:28, where it highlights ethnicity, personal freedom, and gender, but doesn't talk about things like level of education or age. So in short, I'm asking, how does Basil conceive of the categories of his notion of all? Because we all have categories, as Peter pointed out earlier, but I think that's another categorization. My second question is whether it is possible that this is a development over time in which some aspects of his idea of koinopheles wanes or morphs over time instead of accumulates. So could it be that he begins with a rather lofty notion of wisdom accessible to all, then he sees the reality of the famine that affects the poor and turns to this practical aspect of wealth distribution. And then still later, he sees sort of the damage of divisive teachings and perhaps more cynically doesn't see those positive effects over time and then sort of turns to doctrine instead. Could he have changed his views over time is what I'm asking, moving from wisdom to money to doctrine as he sees the world around him differently as he grows older? Again, my interest in thinking about the life course. And finally, I want to look at the third instance of this word, koinopheles, more closely, because for me, of the three, it's the outlier. It's from a different genre, there's a different purpose. The images, to me, aren't as clear. The first two are great images, and this one is a bit murky. And you have the sentence, "We have learned that you neither cursorily nor carelessly omit the common goods, plural, and necessities for salvation, but you intend to produce something for the administration of the churches." So I note here the plural of the noun form. And I'm wondering what that plural might say to the sense of it. Does it encompass a plurality of ideas or a plurality of actions, or is it something else? And you seem to equate common goods, goods here with salvation. And I am wondering whether these are perhaps mutually exclusive, common goods and necessities for salvation, both being helpful for church administration in Basil's mind. And if so, how might this shift the idea of the common good or goods? So I hope that I've represented at least some of what your work is in a reasonable way and offered a few ideas. As I put all three of these papers together, I have a few concluding observations, especially as we think about this New Horizons theme. So first, there are different ways to consider the social layer of the ancient texts. So we might be looking at one moment or era, or we might consider social development over time. We've seen here an exploration of social aspects of an individual within a life course. We've seen glimpses of the context within social history, and we've also seen the use of sociological theory. And so the papers we heard this afternoon demonstrate, I think, some of the challenges, but also the questions, the richness, and the depth that come from considering social context in these ways. Second, each of these papers point to questions of power dynamics and of identity. And I think these are questions that we in Canada and perhaps our US and other folks around the world are grappling with on a number of levels. So each touches on political powers of the time, but focuses more on the idealism, realization, identity markers, and struggles of those affected perhaps less by the political and more by the social powers within their lives. So Brian mentions this order in the midst of disorder in regards to Basil's letter to the bishops. And I think typically we organize the principles, we think of the organizing principles of time, characterized as perhaps temporal and eternal. We read these in the patristic writings, or space, the earthly and the transcendent. And just thought about this image of order and disorder, of chaos and structure that seems to be something I see in all three papers. So Evagrius desires to seek good, grounded order at a political level. This is followed by his sort of chaotic life of leaving this life and seeking a different order among the monks. So there's a bit of an exchange there for him personally. The description of the events and of the martyrs of Lyons suggest a chaos resulting from anger, accusations, and rioting, and then the state decision to allow the martyrdoms to attempt to bring some level of order. Although perhaps more importantly, the recounting of the story within the text itself is a sort of reordering of the chaotic events for those who are writing later. And then we have Basil's notion of the common good as a way to find order within wisdom, distributed wealth, and orthodoxy amidst the chaos of status differences, the effects of famine and heterodoxy, and perhaps other things. And perhaps in a meta sense, perhaps for ourselves as this academic enterprise that we all have decided is going to be our life's work, perhaps in some ways we are seeking to bring order to chaos. And this speaks somehow to our experience of the world that we share a little bit with our ancient informants, encountering the unknown and the known, the chaotic and the ordered, working to engage the chaos, but also trying to bring a sense of order and thus of meaning to our own life experiences. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mona. That was great. I think what we'd like to do is give each one of our three panelists an opportunity to respond. I think what we'll ask with the time that we have is maybe of the various questions or insights that Mona posed, perhaps the one that really strikes to you rather, not that it struck out. Did you say you teach on zombies, by the way, or personifies? I couldn't quite catch that. Did you say zombies?
It was zombies. Zombies, the Bible, and the end of the world. Yeah,
okay, well, that's fascinating. So Robin, I'll start with you if that's all right. And if you can just take a couple of minutes and we'll give you a chance to respond.
Yes, thank you. Actually trying as a thesis, as an investigative tool to challenge the primarily monastic interpretation of Evagrius. So I don't think that he didn't write for monks, he did, but I think he fashioned himself, looking back to the 2nd and 3rd century, fashioned himself as a sage, as someone who could advise, and who, in much the same way that Origen evidently thought that he was superior to a bishop, so did Evagrius think he was superior to a bishop. Now, I think that this attitude actually sort of enters into the later tradition in both East and West, so that there is a kind of tension between monk or monastic order and bishop and episcopal order. But I think in this period, it's particularly important because there is a reason to rehabilitate the Gnostikos, and that both has to do with the outward-facing character of Christianity as a competitor in the, I hate to use this word, but it's old, marketplace of ideas, and also inward-facing, because without the Gnostikos as a teacher, Christians have no way to be taught. They have no way to advance, and that is a requirement for following Christ, which is to say, to follow the oikonomia of Christ. So I think he actually was, in some sense, I want to say almost a reactionary in his social positioning. And that's, I think, why he parted company with Basil and Gregory, and not the colorful story of the impetuous woman and the mother figure. And that too can be contested, interestingly, but I think I'll leave it there. Thank you so much. Thanks for your really illuminating responses to all the papers.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you. Paul.
So maybe just concentrating on the topic of methodology, maybe some subsets underneath that. First of all, I really appreciate your pushback on the emic etic issue. So when I read your response, to this extent, I was just going to drop out the paper because I think you're right on that critique. But then I thought, well, to be fair to you and the listeners, they need to hear that and the critique back. I think what I'm probably, frankly, getting more at is not so much that then as the view of the oppressed and the oppressor. And I'm on the outside of both of those, actually, reading, as a third party person reading the text. But I do find interesting that, to my knowledge, most social scientific theory looking at martyr texts has been looking at the construction of the oppressed, the self-identity of the Christians as they see themselves. So I'm trying to open up a new window of seeing how the oppressors, the persecutors, might be explained better with some type of rationale, even if we don't agree with the rationale. So I appreciate that very much. If someone in the audience could help me out on this one or send me an email later on I know that there's various Phrygians and from Pergamum and so on that stress the text of new immigrants who are coming who are Christian. And outside the letter, Irenaeus, of course, came from Asia Minor to Lyons. What I don't know, and I need to figure out how to find this out, is how much immigration in general, not just Christians, but just people in this time period coming from Asia Minor to Lyon and Vienne to Lugdunum, that would help me out in kind of thinking through how much the issue of strangeness and foreignness might be a part of the whole scenario. So that would be a helpful thing on that one. And then kind of finally with that methodology issue, also appreciated a critique of, can we really apply modern theory to an ancient text? I appreciated the quote I had there of Aldrich when he says urban writers of all historical eras tend to engage in a fairly standard set of behaviors, and he kind of lists those. So I'm wondering if, especially the broader the facets, not so narrow, but if they're being descriptive of how things tend to function, they can still be helpful heuristic devices sociologically in reading an ancient text. I could speak more of that. I'll stop, I think, at that point. But thank you very much for your critiques, Mona. I appreciate them.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you, Paul. Brian.
Yeah, thanks, Mona. I had sent you an email earlier today too, appreciating your attention to our papers. Yeah, you asked 3 questions. I'm still going to think about the first one for a little bit, and I won't take time with that. The second one you were asking about is whether there's really more of development of thought rather than accumulation of ideas here. And I will give that some more thought, but I would like to stick with accumulate for a little while longer. And the reason is, even when he writes that third letter in 377, the work of the various philanthropy projects in Caesarea was ongoing, and we have still him producing a sermon on the love for the poor. You see this also in the other two, his brother Nyssa and Gregory of Nazianzus, writing similar kinds of treatises. And even after Basil is dead, that's one of the features of Gregory's oration, funeral oration in honor of Basil, is to comment specifically on his attention over many years to the needs of those on the margins. So I don't think it waned, that second concept waned. I think it was an accumulation for him, but I will give a thought to maybe the first one, whether the first one wanes. But since I see it also in Evagrius is interested in Solomon and wisdom, maybe that doesn't wane either, but it really is accumulation. So that were my thoughts initially about that, your second question. And then the other one you asked about is this plural notion of the common goods, whether that means something perhaps different than common good. I just think because Basil had in mind a range of things that pointed to a good administration of the churches, that's why he pivoted to the plural there rather than staying with the singular. And yet in the rest of the letter, because he's so hyper concerned about making sure the Orthodox faith is preserved for the people, I still think that even though he's referring specifically to a range of practices bishops do to create common goods, that nevertheless there is still a singular thing in mind, and that is the flourishing of human persons, both in the church, or in the case of the other two texts, in the world, and of course, a right-ordered human reason. So I think the use of the plural there is more a feature of his thought of the range of things bishops do, but nevertheless, it's still a singular concept of human flourishing is operating. But I'm open to being critiqued on that or people having other ideas, and I welcome that.
Thank you very much yes. Thanks to all three of you for these various pieces. I will want to open it up for others to be able to ask questions and comment, but thank you for letting me engage and then engaging with my questions. So thank you.
Thanks.
Absolutely. To ensure your succinctness, I'll invite if anyone has a question to use the chat feature for now. Let's use that, jot down a question if you have one. I do want to open it up to Brian, Paul, and Robin and ask if any of you have any thoughts for each other. So I'll open it up to you as others might write some chats down there. We'll start with you. Any thoughts for the papers you've heard from your co-panelists? Or zombies, whatever strikes you.
Or maybe we are a zombie. Maybe I am a zombie.
I don't know. If not, then yeah, we'll open it up to any other questions or comments. We only have 5 minutes before our final break. And just a reminder that our last session is the most brief, just 1 hour and 15 minutes with 3 small 20-minute papers and a time of questions. So that's our last leg for the day. But again, any questions at all? John, you told me you had some questions. What do you got?
Yeah, thanks for calling me out there, Donnie boy.
Well, you said you had something, so let's hear it.
Well, I actually had a lot of questions for each of the presenters, but I'm gonna just limit my question to Brian. Brian, I really enjoyed your paper. I'm curious if Basil ever refers to the Stoic doctrine of oikonosis, which seems to me to be a complementary, perhaps, principle of social ethics to the common good. the common good, is so laden with political connotations as a top-down kind of concept, whereas the Stoic oikeiosis really puts the onus on each individual and his or her responsibilities towards others. Does Basil ever apply that term in any of his discussions?
Yeah, sorry. And as you're saying, somebody was just texting something to me about it as well. Well, off the top of my head, I don't know how often that word shows up in his writings. So I would have to go and think about that a little bit more. It is a term that is used in that letter 265. It's the word from which he derives the for what I've translated, administration of the churches there. He's picking up on that idea of the right oikonomia, but that's not exactly the term you're talking about. But I think he thinks in those ways, yeah, that we have in our individual, in these spheres, we have responsibilities that we have to accept and to carry on. So I'd like to think about that. I would need to look up a bit more and whether that word shows up in the ways you're asking.
Okay, thank you.
And Brian, you saw this question here about parallel terms that might be more common for flourishing.
Yeah, so I did mention, so the term koine is really a term that is, he uses that of our common humanity. That's where it's most frequently employed. And so every time he uses the word koine, that is a sort of a red flag picking for me to pay more attention in the text. And so, yeah, in another part of this project, I have cataloged his use of that term and tried to map it out as well. But basically what we're seeing is the linking, and I should say I'm not the first one to have done this, but maybe the first one to have done it in some more, in a way connecting with koinophiles, but also Brian Daly and Susan Holman have also done some of this work as well. But koine and koinophiles are linked in the concept of philanthropia. And so so in another part of this project, which I didn't present today, is demonstrating how the koinophiles and our sense of the common good in the polis and the spiritual realm in our minds is really a manifestation of our awareness of the koine among ourselves as just human beings. And he also talks about our koine with the animal realm as well. So Basil has a pretty broad sense of our responsibilities to the world, both to the other elements of creation as well as human persons. But there's the link between those two is another term he uses is philanthropia. Yeah, but yeah, anyway, I know you're running out of time, so.
All right. Okay, any last questions? Last chance. We are up against the deadline, but maybe time for one more if one pops up here. Otherwise, we will pause till the bottom of the hour. I will be opening up the breakout rooms here in a moment if our moderators and 6 speakers want to go in there in the next few moments. And as I said, this will be our last session for the day. And we will start those parallel groups in 10 minutes. We're on schedule, so we're doing good. So again, thank you, Robin, Paul, Brian, and Mona. That was a wonderful session. Really appreciate that. And for John, who organized those together in a very effective grouping. So well done. Thank you. I think you did. Did you not? Okay, fine. You didn't.
You did. I did the other one. I did the.
Oh, well, there you go. Okay, so
one.
yay me. I'll take the credit then if you want to give it. Thank you. And okay, so yes, at 4:30, our 2 sessions are Early Christianity and its Institutions. We've got papers from John, Robert Edwards, and Andrew Summerson. And then the second group, Early Christian Biblical Interpretation, moderated by Matthew Fraser, with papers by Nathan Porter, Matthew Clem, and Corinne Milad. Did I say that right? It used to be Boersma. I don't know this new name, how to say it. So I will open these groups up and we will get started at 4:30. So thank you, everyone.